Welcome back. Today we are going to be talking about the hypothalamus and the anterior and posterior pituitary gland. This is the third video in the endocrine system. Please make sure you've watched Endocrine 1 and Endocrine 2 before you attempt this video. So today we're going to be talking about the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is really sort of the boss of the anterior and posterior pituitary. You can see the hypothalamus is up here, and it's this area. And remember when we learned about the structures of the brain, we looked at sort of the little bird face, and here's the eye of the bird, and then the sort of crest, and then here's the belly of the bird or the pons, and then the medulla down there. So we're really looking at sort of the beak of the bird, and that would be this area right here. And hanging down from the beak is something that looks like, maybe like a little seed or something like that, and that's actually the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is actually made up of two portions. We've got the posterior pituitary, which again is posterior, which is why it's called that, and the anterior pituitary, which is anterior. And they both are involved with hormones and regulation of the body, but they do it in kind of a different way. So again, the hypothalamus is the area of the body that is the control center for a lot of different systems in the body. It controls temperature regulation, it controls thirst, sleep-wake cycles, hunger, all kinds of different homeostatic set points in the body. So let's talk about the posterior pituitary first. The posterior pituitary doesn't actually produce any hormones by itself. The hormones are produced in the hypothalamus, and we have these neurons where the cell body is at the top, and then there's a long axon, and then the axon terminal is down here in the posterior pituitary. And so what happens is the hypothalamus actually produces the hormones, and the posterior pituitary only releases them. It stores them and releases them when signaled to do so by the hypothalamus. So the two hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus and released by the posterior pituitary are ADH and oxytocin. So let's talk about ADH first. ADH is going to get released when blood osmotic pressure increases. So for example, when you start to get dehydrated and your blood starts to get a little bit thicker, a little more stuff in it, there's more osmotic pressure in it. That is the stimulus that is going to trigger osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus. Those osmoreceptors are going to tell the hypothalamus that you are getting dehydrated. And so the hypothalamus is the control center. And the hypothalamus is going to send out instructions to two areas of the body. One is going to be your thirst center, which is going to cause you to become thirsty and start drinking more water. And the other one is it's going to release, or tell the posterior pituitary to release, ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone. An antidiuretic hormone is going to be released into the bloodstream, because remember, this is endocrine system, so it goes directly into the blood. It's going to circulate through the body, and it's going to end up in the kidneys, and it's going to act on the collecting duct of the kidneys. And we're going to learn more about this in the urinary system, but what it does is it inserts little aquaporins in the collecting duct, which allows water to leave the collecting duct and come back into the body. So it essentially is going to increase water reabsorption. And ADH gets produced usually late at night when you're sleeping and you haven't had anything to drink for a while, and it allows us to concentrate our urine, which is why in the morning you will see that your urine is usually darker in color and there's less volume to it. Again, because we're not drinking at night, usually all night long, we need to sort of conserve that water to maintain proper water balance. Now, one interesting thing is that if you drink alcohol, alcohol inhibits this reaction right here. So instead of producing antidiuretic hormone when you start to get dehydrated, you're going to keep on peeing out a lot of water, which is why sometimes when you've been drinking quite some time, you will feel like you have to go to the bathroom all the time. So you're constantly running off to the bathroom at the bar. It's also why when you have been drinking all night, you tend to feel terrible the next day. You have a hangover, and it's because you actually got dehydrated. So you will lose more water than you are bringing in with your drinking. So one of the things you can do to counteract this is just try to drink another water. So for example, have a beer, have a water, have a beer, have a water. Might help. Next hormone is oxytocin. So oxytocin is sort of known as the love hormone. So both men and women produce oxytocin. Oxytocin has sort of two main functions in women that we usually talk about. One of them is that it causes milk letdown. So if you are a nursing mother, the suckling action of the baby will send signals up to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus will stimulate the posterior pituitary to produce oxytocin, and oxytocin will cause the milk to let down. Now, sometimes you don't even need the baby to start suckling. Just hearing a crying baby will cause the hypothalamus to release oxytocin, and that's when the milk starts coming out, even if the baby's not ready yet. The other thing that can happen at the same time is this suckling action is going to stimulate the hypothalamus to stimulate the anterior pituitary, and it will produce a hormone called prolactin, which we're going to talk about in a couple minutes, that stimulates milk production by the mammary glands. Other area where oxytocin is important is during childbirth. So oxytocin also stimulates uterine muscle contractions. So when the baby's still inside, before he's out here, when the baby gets big enough, it starts to press down on the cervix. So there's a lot of pressure on the cervix. And eventually that baby gets so heavy and the pressure gets so strong that the cervix is going to start sending signals up to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is going to tell the posterior pituitary to release oxytocin. Oxytocin is going to act on the uterus and cause the uterine muscles to squeeze, to contract, which is in turn going to put more pressure on the cervix. The cervix will send more signals to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus will produce more oxytocin. The posterior pituitary will release the oxytocin, and that will cause more contraction. So you can kind of see that this is a little bit of a different feedback loop than what we usually talk about, in that we're not reducing the pressure on the cervix, we're actually increasing the pressure on the cervix. So this is an example of positive feedback. And again, most of the mechanisms in the body are negative feedback, but this happens to be, childbirth happens to be one of the positive feedback ones. So this keeps going round and around and around until eventually the uterine contractions get so strong that they're strong enough to push out the baby. So those are the two hormones involved with the posterior pituitary. Now let's talk about the anterior pituitary. That's over here. Now, the anterior pituitary has more hormones associated with it, and this is a true gland, meaning that it produces its own hormones and releases them directly into the bloodstream. The hypothalamus is involved with it in that it does control what is being produced, but instead of producing the hormones in the hypothalamus itself, it is just telling the anterior pituitary to produce them. So we actually have 6 hormones that are produced by the anterior pituitary. So let's talk about thyroid stimulating hormone first. So thyroid stimulating hormone is part of this sort of complicated levels of control, in that the hypothalamus, up here, the bird beak, is going to produce something called a releasing hormone, thyroid releasing hormone, and that's going to act on the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is going to respond to that releasing hormone, and it's going to make and secrete a second hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. Thyroid stimulating hormone is actually going to act on the target gland, which in this case is the thyroid gland. Thyroid gland is sort of at the base of your neck, sort of where the hollow is, at the bottom of your neck. The thyroid gland is going to respond to the thyroid stimulating hormone by producing thyroxine or thyroid hormone. Now, why do we make it so complicated? It's so that we have a lot of different ways to regulate the system. So, for example, as the level of thyroid hormone grows, it can feed back on both the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. It can shut down this system and this system, which is helpful in making sure that we don't overproduce this thyroid hormone or thyroxine. What does thyroid hormone actually do? Well, it increases your metabolic rate. One of the things that can happen is if the level of thyroid hormone falls too low, you're going to encourage the production of thyroid releasing hormone, which is going to trigger the production of thyroid stimulating hormone. If you don't have enough iodine, the thyroid gland will not be able to make thyroid hormone, but it will continue to be stimulated to make thyroid hormone. Because it can't make it, it will continue to go through mitosis and it will continue to grow. And this can cause the formation of a goiter. Now, we don't see this so much in this country because all of our salt is sold with iodine added to it. So we don't really have a lack of iodine, and we use so much salt in our food in this country that we don't really seem to have too much problems with that. The other issue that you can run into with the thyroid gland is you can have something called Hashimoto's disease. And this is actually quite common, especially in middle-aged women. And one of the problems here is that you have antibodies that will attack the thyroid gland. And it will make it difficult for the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormone. So you have low levels of thyroid hormone. And even though that low level of thyroid hormone is causing both the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary to try to make the thyroid gland make more thyroid hormone, it's just not able to do so. And so you have a slowing of your metabolic rate because you have less thyroid hormone. Okay, so the actions of all of the hormones from the anterior pituitary, already talked about prolactin. This is going to work in conjunction with oxytocin, and the prolactin is going to stimulate milk production. Remember, oxytocin helped to stimulate the letdown of milk. So you have to produce the milk first, then you can let it down. Growth hormone is going to stimulate growth and repair of your cells. So you're going to have a lot of growth hormone when you're young or when you're pregnant, and a lot less of it when you're older. Thyroid stimulating hormone, we just talked about that. It increases your metabolic rate. Luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, we're going to talk about again when we get to the reproductive system, but they work to stimulate the gonads and increase production of sperm or eggs. And then there is adrenocorticotropic hormone, which we like to shorten to ACTH for obvious reasons. And this is going to stimulate cortisol production. So this works on the adrenal glands. We've already talked about the adrenal glands. In the Endocrine I video, we discussed the release of norepinephrine and epinephrine from the adrenal medulla. Remember that this helps in the short-term stress when the sympathetic nervous system activates the fight or flight response. In the Endocrine II video, we discussed the production of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. This helps to regulate the blood pressure by increasing sodium and water retention in the kidneys. So this is going to increase your blood pressure when aldosterone is present. In this video, we're going to cover ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, which causes or triggers, when produced by the anterior pituitary, it's going to trigger the release of cortisol. And cortisol is a hormone that helps in the stress response. It promotes the repair of damaged tissues by breaking down muscle tissue, and it floods your bloodstream with glucose. Cortisol also suppresses the immune system by down-regulating the inflammatory response. And this all sounds like a very good thing, but it's not. If you're in stress for a long time, oops, I guess I forgot. let's just forget this part. If you are in stress for a long time, downregulating the immune system can actually leave you susceptible to infection. And flooding the bloodstream with glucose all the time means that you are now causing a huge reaction from the pancreas, trying to put that glucose back into your cells. And so you sort of go down the path towards diabetes if you have high cortisol levels a lot of the time. And so cortisol is very helpful if you have short momentary bursts of stress that you need to deal with, but it's not very good for you if you're just sort of under low levels of constant stress. Our current culture kind of promotes low levels of constant stress, and so you really want to make sure that you are managing your stress levels. Otherwise, this will lead to diabetes and being immunocompromised. That's it for today. See you in class.